if you have really good pattern recognition, you'll also recognize that sometimes these longer questions follow a pretty familiar pattern. Welcome, everyone, to the 7Sage LSAT podcast. I'm Henry, and I'm joined by Max today. Max, how are we doing?
I'm back again, guys. It's great to be here.
Back again. Crushed the first round, and, just making you a regular.
I know. My viewership rates must have been crazy because I got invited back again. They wanted another round. It's crazy.
Yeah. We like people who can perform,
This is true.
Ostensibly, that's what we try to do at 7Sage, teach people how to perform. Not on podcasts, but on the LSAT.
On the LSAT. Yeah. It's a performance thing.
Isn't the LSAT in the podcast? They have so many similarities. So I guess we'll jump in to what we're talking about, which is a common question about timing issues. And people say that they have issues either with timing in terms that they can't get to the end, or they have like a fatigue issue where they're performing much worse on the fourth section and the third section. And so, of course, as they go through the test, and there's always a fourth section. I guess if you have an accommodation, there might not always be a fourth section, but there will always be a last section for you to do. And if you're doing worse on that last section, the question is, how do you get better at doing that last section? I don't know. Max, any thoughts?
I think the modern students have it a lot harder than I did. This is my take on it. Because there's only two sections, there's not a ton of variance in the material you're seeing, right? Like with the previous version of the exam, the total number of sections you could get back to back that were identical was what, 2, right? Because you could go LR, and then you were guaranteed to see reading, comp, and logic games on the back too, right? I think that now, with there only being 2 sections, there's a chance you get a test configuration that is 75 straight LR questions followed by 1 RC section that to be scored, and you haven't seen any RC section on your exam to date. That can be really, really challenging. I do think it's a very real thing, but I also think there are definitely some concrete steps you can take to kind of avoid the fatigue issue and ways that you can kind of try to overcome it. It's not an unsolvable issue, is basically what I'm saying.
Yeah, right. I imagine if it was an unsolvable issue, it'd be a pretty short podcast.
That would be
nice for us. We get out quickly.
Sorry, you're up the creek. We can't help you.
Yeah. So I maybe we could talk about one thing that I probably don't recommend doing, which is, and I've seen it sometimes recommended, which is practice taking the test when you're tired, or end of the day, do a section. And so you can, I don't know. I personally think that's kind of ridiculous myself. I mean, maybe that's what you did. But I don't think you can really train to reason when you're tired. Or I mean, if you can, it's minimal. I don't know. It's that kind of a line with what you understand.
Yeah, I mean, there's not. This is a terrible idea to take it when you're tired. I totally agree with that. Right? Mm-hmm. There's a difference between taking it under test conditions and taking it under unrealistic punishing conditions for the sake of what? Additionally punishing yourself, right? That doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah.
You have to take it under test conditions. You should be taking it at the same kind of day that you're planning on taking the test. Optimally, if you're taking it remote, the same room, right? You can get pretty close to simulating it that way. Mm-hmm. But I do think that taking it when you're tired or intentionally trying to take it in environments where it's unduly punishing has 2 effects. 1, I don't necessarily know that it's realistic training. And 2, I think that the morale hit you can get when your score is significantly lower than, say, you've been scoring otherwise could be really, really detrimental to your long-term performance. Seeing increased negative PT scores is a feedback loop. I don't think that's disputable. It can create a feedback loop.
Yeah, no, that is really true. And not to mention, beyond that too, you want to study when you're feeling fresh so you can understand the material. And so if you're not at the point where you're really ready to take the test fully, taking sections when you're tired, I don't want to say it's wasting questions, but it's not as good. It's not as good of a learning environment. And so the recommendation, I mean, I think that we're moving towards, you should be thinking this less of a question of I need to reason when I'm tired. It's how can we avoid being tired or having too much cognitive overload in the first place? But how can we make it so by the time we get to the fourth section, it's not like we are fatigued. It's that the first 2 or 3 sections hasn't been hard enough to really fatigue us to begin with. And so I think that's where we're kind of heading towards here, right? Which is some strategies that you can employ or how to think about studying so that you aren't fatigued going into the fourth section rather than how can I be better when I am fatigued. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think the objective should be how do I perform better when I'm tired. It is how can I be notably less tired walking into section 4 than I currently am.
Okay. So maybe we could jump into some like big picture ideas, and then maybe we can offer some more minute, recommendations. One of the things that we're thinking about is like accuracy,
Mhm.
right? Like, how can we improve our accuracy? And there's a ton of things that we can do, or there's a ton of things that we do when we're answering a question that maybe we're accurate, but it creates and we're doing the problems correctly under untimed conditions. But when we're doing it under time conditions, it's much more psychologically stressful. So I think one of the things that we were talking about a little bit before this podcast is this idea of you know taking a lot of effort to eliminate wrong answers,
Mhm.
right? Where you're looking at a question, you look at an answer, you like it, and then you look at the wrong answers, and maybe you have a sense that they're wrong, but it's really difficult to eliminate them, or you find that it's hard to eliminate. What would you recommend to someone who's in that place?
To me, it's about having faith in your process. It's
Mm,
about having faith in your training. It's about trusting your training, right?
yeah.
I think that something I see all the time with people that really struggle with fatigue is they will read an answer choice that they know to be wrong within 5 words of reading it, right? So, like, let's say for an argument part question where you're asked to describe the role of an argument, you know that the thing you're trying to evaluate is a premise, right? And an answer choice starts off with "it is a conclusion," right? I think a lot of people are like, okay, well, maybe I'll read the rest of it and it'll change my mind about my initial read. And then
Mm,
I'll know that this might be the correct answer and I might have missed it otherwise. No, no, no. You have to have faith in your training. You have to trust in your process, not to quote Joel Embiid too hard here, right?
yeah,
But you
yeah.
do really have to trust it because unfortunately, right, that's all you have walking in on test day. So if you are reading the entire answer after you know for sure it's wrong or it doesn't align with your initial read, you've got two options. Either you're going to doubt that initial read, you're going to doubt the training you did to diagnose the argument in the first place, or you're going to spend 15 to 20 extra seconds trying to convince yourself that maybe you were wrong or trying to reconfirm the idea that you already know to be true. And neither one of those things is productive. Your objective needs to be believe in your initial read and make decisions confidently based off of
Yeah, right. So if there's a single piece of the answer choice that's wrong,
it.
you
Hmm.
don't have to figure out why the rest of the answer choice is bad or good. The entire answer choice needs to be good for it to be a right answer. And so when you're if you're in a testing environment, i.e., you're doing a PT or you're doing a section, and you see that an answer like half of the answers is wrong, just skip it then, right? You know that that's not going to be a good answer. So I do think that that's a pretty good strategy to employ, which is, and this maybe is another segue too into how like what we're doing during a test is sometimes different than what we're doing while we're studying, right? Where when you're studying, it can be helpful to really go through the exact details of why a particular answer choice is not great or is great. But when you're in a testing environment and you look at an answer and it feels wrong, or and maybe you see the first half is bad, or it just feels awkward, there's no real reason to sit there and think, well, what exactly about this is so bad? When you could keep on moving, and then maybe answer choice D is just looks obviously good to you, right? You want to get to answers D as quickly as possible. You want to avoid sitting on an answer choice because not because you think it's right, because you don't really see how it's wrong. No, skip it, right? Keep on going until you get to an answers that you like. And if you don't like any answers, of course you can always go back. But you want to make sure that you're testing, you're trusting your process. But then also when you're doing a test, it's like you don't need to figure out exactly why every answer choice is wrong. If you trust your process and you have a sense that it's wrong, say like, I don't know, we'll just skip this for now. Come back to it if nothing else is good. So I think that's a pretty good way to talk about, or I mean, it's a good way to think about eliminating wrong answers. I think the other dimension to this too is maybe you aren't as good at recognizing right answers to begin with. But like, I guess that strategy kind of relies, or the strategy we just talked about, kind of relies on hopefully you getting to a right answer and
it.
identifying
Hmm.
that. Whereas
Hmm.
maybe you're someone who, when you're doing untimed tests or untimed practice, a lot of the way you get to your answer is by eliminating 4 wrong ones first and then figuring out what the right one is, and I think that can be good, but I also think that it's a bit of a time sink too.
Hmm.
So maybe we could speak on, like, how to improve our accuracy.
Yeah, so okay, there's a couple things that I have to say with regard to accuracy. First of all, I think that the more practice you do generally, the better you get at identifying the patterns. I think a lot of this test is a pattern recognition exam, and
Yes.
recognizing right answers does actually involve just seeing a ton of questions, right? Um, that said, I also think that there's an element of getting to the correct answer that also requires understanding that you have to increase the level of semantic, nitpicky decisions that you are willing to make as the number of the question increases. Basically, on questions, 1 through 15, you're probably going to be able to see a right answer that is pretty clearly correct. It pretty clearly distinguishes itself most of the time, assuming it's not an outlier,
Hmm.
right? Above question 16, you're going to have to make decisions like this answer choice is right because it makes a word differentiation from a different answer choice that is closer to what I need it to be. It says some instead of all, right?
Yeah.
Or it says none instead of almost none, right? And you're going to have to make that decision. And to that end, a really, really helpful exercise, at least in my mind, is really trying to get nitpicky with what you need the correct answer to look like, right? On some questions. And also keeping yourself open. Something I see happen all the time on those higher level questions is you get so used to reading stimuli in the first 15 that are just like, oh, I can prephrase this, right?
Yeah.
Confused is sufficient for necessary, appeals to an inadequate authority, circular reasoning, whatever, right? You can prephrase your way into the flaw or into what the assumption is going to look like, whatever. And then you get to the higher level questions, and all of a sudden that doesn't work anymore.
Yeah.
And what you have to be willing to do is keep your mind open, because what I have found is an effective strategy is just to recognize that sometimes an answer choice can be correct and it can point something out that maybe you didn't see the first time, but you have to be willing to keep yourself open to seeing that and not to sticking really hard to your guns.
Yeah. So I mean, I think there's two well, three components, but we'll start with the two that I
Hmm.
heard that is with respect to feeling fatigued towards the end of the section or the end of the test. Looking for those little nitpicky things is very mentally taxing and stressful. And so if you're constantly looking for little nitpicks, that is going to add to your cognitive overload towards the end of the test. So what I'm hearing you say is like the first 10 or so questions, maybe 10 to 15, there's not going to be as much nitpicking that you need to do to get the answers right. And so if you tell yourself question 2, I probably don't need to be as nitpicky for it as I would for question 15. You're saving some mental energy towards the end. Now, of course, when you're flipping and you hit question 15 and beyond, you want to be open to every single answers because those questions do involve a lot more nitpicking. And so, what I'm hearing, or correct me if I'm wrong, is ultimately you want to be devoting more of your like mental energy towards the last 15, whereas the first 10 to 15 you can play it a little bit more according to your intuition. Of course, this is assuming that you've done some training and some studying to begin with. Is that right?
Yeah, I agree. There's a drill that tutors that are associated with 7 Sage will often assign clients. I often assign it. I think it's a very effective drill where you will make clients do the first 15 questions of an LR set in 15 minutes, which is
Mm,
about 30 seconds faster per question than they would normally have, assuming no accommodations. The reason that this works is it trains you to move quickly and confidently under pressure so that you can artificially manufacture yourself more time on the questions that take more time,
mm,
right? I think that there is this assumption that is widespread among the LSAT community, and that is that you have to be able to move super quickly or like very quickly on questions that are really long and complicated. Parallel reasoning, parallel flaw, questions that have a long answer choices, right? And the answer is yeah, sometimes, but not all the time. Those questions are designed to take more time. It's the reason that you should be moving very quickly on, say, very easy main conclusion questions, right? Because then you can devote more time to those very difficult questions where you have long answer choices and long stimuli that you kind of have to parse through.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's entirely right. And I think too. I mean, I like that you're bringing up some of the longer questions because sometimes you do spend a long amount of time on the longer questions, whether it's a parallel question or even like a long weakening question. Uh, that being said, to the first point we talked about or you mentioned in terms of pattern recognition, if you have really good pattern recognition, you'll also recognize that sometimes these longer questions follow a pretty familiar pattern. There can be some very long weakening questions that are just a phenomenon hypothesis. And so, as you mentioned earlier, if you are good at that pattern recognition and you're good at recognizing, man, when I see a phenomenon hypothesis and I'm in a weakening question, I really like to introduce alternative explanations. You'll be able to look for answers that do that and then maybe just outright pick them because you know, like, wait, this fits the pattern that I'm used to. And I can confidently pick something like B without really considering, A, C, D, and E that much. If it's the first 10 questions. If it's the last 10 questions, then I'm definitely, I'm glancing at the other answer choices and giving them a pass. But I would feel more comfortable being like, yeah, this is probably the right answer. Okay, A doesn't really look like an alternative explanation. C, D, and E also don't. So we can pass those up and pick that. Again, too, a lot of that is just trying to reduce your load so you don't have to think about the problem on an individual basis, but think of it more along the lines of like, this is within a family of arguments that I've seen before. So, yeah, I think it's all pretty good. Did you have something you wanted to add to that?
No, I think you put that real well.
Nice. So, I mean, I guess we could maybe talk a little bit about some at the more minute level, talking about some common patterns to be thinking about when you are looking at a question type. I mean, for me, one of the more common you're talking about main conclusion questions. Main conclusion questions, a lot of them have this very common pattern where like some people say something and then the author shifts and says, but maybe they're not entirely right, or let me make an adjustment and here's why. And so if they're not entirely right, let me make an adjustment. Usually that's the conclusion. And so if you see that pattern in a main conclusion question, what you can do is like, oh, I kind of think this is the conclusion. Let me look for an answer that says that, oh, it's right there. Be a little bit more efficient. So I think that's one pattern that you can see. Do you have any other patterns that you feel like you know throughout different types of LR questions?
Every other pattern that I know is actually kind of stemming from the idea that you're talking about right now, right? Which is, I would like to categorize it as the author of the passage is trying to trick you. The person who wrote the question is kind of trying to trick you, right?
Yeah.
Because what they're doing is they're assuming that, you're going to read this and you're going to be like, oh, some people say this, that must be the conclusion because that's the first point of view that I read and that must be what it is, right? They're operating on the fact that you're not going to read carefully. You're not going to read that the author shifts perspectives, right?
Yeah.
And so I actually think that a lot of the patterns have to do kind of with that sort of like tricky language or tricky wording, right? For me, I think the patterns that you have to look out for, I think that you can pretty clearly diagram some of the conditional reasoning ones, so you don't necessarily need to look out too hard for those. Causation and correlation. You need to know those like the back of your hand. If you know causation and correlation and the fact that just because two things occur at the same rate or are correlated with one another does not mean that one thing causes the other ever, right?
Yeah.
That will be incredibly helpful. The other thing that you can really employ to like use that is to try to evaluate it with some level of like common sense and practicality. Like, yes, it's true that just because two things are correlated, that could mean they're independent, right? But if we have a real world basis to believe that they're not independent of one another, then maybe the problem is different, right? Maybe the thing that is happening here is different. A good example, right, might be I tell you, right, that there's an LSAT question that tells you that the use of cold medicine, right, and cold symptoms are correlated with one another. So as one goes up, the other goes up, right?
Right.
And what you see is the argument asserts that clearly then, right, the cold medicine causes you to develop more severe cold symptoms, right?
Yeah, of course.
And so the problem there is not that cold medicine and cold symptoms are independent of one another, because we can evaluate that using just like our real world common sense. That doesn't make sense, right? Those two things probably are connected. But it also doesn't make sense to say that cold medicine causes you to have more severe cold symptoms. Then what you can do is you can say, okay, there's probably causation. I know that from, my common sense, but this causation doesn't make sense. What if I flip it around? Does it make sense that having more severe cold symptoms causes you to take more cold medicine? Well, yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And then at that point, you can move forward and look for the answer choice that describes that kind of flip.
Yeah. No, that's I entirely agree. Right, where you look at the correlation, and it's like, okay, interesting. I mean, I think what you give is a pretty good example too, because it definitely seems absurd to think that the cold medicine would give you cold symptoms. Usually,
it's ridiculous.
I do cancer and chemotherapy in my own class, where I'm like, cancer. People who are on chemotherapy have high cancer rates, and so it must be that chemotherapy causes cancer. When really, it's the flip is the case in real life. What's nice though is like once you know that that pattern exists, there are other instances where it's a lot less intuitive. But nevertheless, because you know correlation doesn't equal causation, you can say, well, there's something else going on here. Right? Whatever. Chocolate is core. Countries that consume a lot of chocolate have a lot of Nobel Prize winners. And so you think, oh, correlation between chocolate and Nobel Prize winning. Chocolate obviously makes you smarter. Now it wouldn't. And now, right, that's obviously not true. But then you think, oh, but what about the flip? Well, okay, does being smart make you eat chocolate? Also, not necessarily the case. Now, what's actually going on there is that wealthy countries can afford luxuries like chocolate, and they can also afford a stronger educational system. Um, and so that's actually what's going on there. But the idea still holds, where he's like, wait a minute, I see a correlation there, and then I'm drawing causation. Maybe there's an alternative explanation even when it's harder to exactly parse out what that alternative explanation might be. I think you can think to yourself, but there must be. There probably is one. And so if you see like a weakening question or a strengthening question that does correlation and causation, you know that right answer choices are usually going to revolve around that alternative idea. Maybe if we could circle back to conditionals too,
Hmm.
because I do think like conditionals are one of those things where they are like a huge trap for like cognitive overload. Because on one hand, if it takes work for you to translate conditionals on test day, that means that some failures happened, right? Where like
Hmm.
translation should not be a difficult thing for you. On test
Hmm.
day, you'd want it so you could easily translate if you needed to. And
Hmm.
so if you find yourself like having trouble translating not unless, which is pretty famously difficult to translate, that means that I would suggest like do a bunch of not unless conditionals and
Hmm.
learn what's the sufficient side and what's the necessary side. I think that there's also though another layer to this is in kind of what you're alluding to, which is that maybe you're really good at translations, but maybe not every time you see conditionals you need to translate it. Right? Like
Mm.
you actually need to write it down. Maybe you mentally translate it, but writing down these long um, sufficient assumption questions, writing down every conditional could be really tough and
Mhm.
taxing. And
Mhm.
so instead thinking about like some common like premise to conclusion gap. I mean, I think that's a huge pattern.
Yep.
And also think about the common traps. You like expect there to be an answer that flips sufficient and necessary. And so you're already aware that, yeah, like I'm going to see this answer choice that flips sufficient necessary. I cannot pick it. And then once you get to it, you eliminate it. Things like that. I don't know. Were you a were conditional something that was tough for you when you were studying or?
Man, oh man, were they? And what you're saying is like something I wish 22-year-old Max could have heard that. Like 22-year-old Max would have benefited so much from somebody being like, dude, you don't have to write everything down. Because when I was training, I thought I saw I made a correlation versus causation error.
Hmm.
I wrote everything down. I saw there was a correlation between me getting questions right and me writing things down on the question. And I assumed that writing everything down on every question would cause me to get more questions correct, but it didn't.
Hmm.
Right? For the exact same reason that doing it on every question would cause you to slowly drift off into that fatigue place over the course of the 4 sections. It's taxing. You are doing a ton of work per question. Limiting the amount of work you do per question, to your point, is probably the best way to reduce fatigue walking into section 4, period, full stop, end of story. So when you're trying to do that, it is a good idea to try to gauge where can I not write as many things down, right? Like where can I ease my mental workload in doing this? A lot of places could be right, like the gap place on sufficient assumption, right? Filling the gap on sufficient assumption is actually the recommendation for me.
Hmm.
You do not have to write that down if there's an obvious gap, right? If they say that like, you know, the university will have to reduce its budget this year on the grounds that the quality of the education will suffer or something like that. And you have to somehow tie the quality of the education suffering to the grounds that the university has to reduce its budget. Why does that evidence lead to this conclusion, right? You don't necessarily need to write that down. You can probably explore that in your head once you get comfortable enough with it. But getting comfortable enough with it is work in and of itself. And you kind of have to do that before you can tackle the fatigue problem, in my mind.
Yeah, yeah. And there's so many. It's like the one element is like the writing everything down so you understand that why it works and that it does work. And then, as you said, you eventually scale it back. Murder is killing. Conclusion: murder is bad. So we got to draw a connection between killing and badness there. So to make this good, and then you could maybe just look at answers that talk about killing and badness, right? That mention those two concepts. Sometimes you eliminate four right away because they don't connect those ideas, and you look, oh yeah, killing and bad. This works. This seems to be going in the right direction. And so yeah, I think that's a good thing to do. It's like just if you just focus on the gap, if you see the gap, don't feel like you need to write everything down. Now, if you do mess up sufficient and necessary, I do think that there is something to be said about thinking ahead of time what side you would want, killing to be on and what side you would want bad on. So maybe writing down the gap could be helpful, like writing down what you want to connect as opposed to writing down the entire argument. But eventually, I'd probably scale that back. Yeah. Do you have anything else to add on conditionals?
No, I think that it's about trying to figure out what works for your brain, right?
Mm,
There's, this idea that the test is just about getting the question right, but it's, I think, more about the process too, right? Like getting a bunch of questions right, but then dropping a bunch because you didn't do those right questions in the way that was the quickest or the easiest for you. That doesn't necessarily mean you were as accurate as you could have been. Right?
yeah.
Moving quickly, finding places that work for you, the test taker, running your own race as the test taker, right? That to me is the thing that's the most important.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think try to do the thing that works for you is a really key idea. I mean, not to go back. Sometimes people like find difficulty with conditional translations because there's a couple ways you could think about translating. I always just like pick one way to translate a thing. Right. If you see not unless you have a specific way you like to translate, that's fine. Just do it the same way every single time. No matter what, it's like, okay, if something works for you, don't try to force some other alternative strategy until your own strategy stops working for you. And then maybe you can think like, how can I roll in some new ideas? I don't know. We haven't talked too much about RC. I didn't have anything down too much for RC. Do you have any RC endurance tips or not endurances, but like, do you have any tips for RC in terms of making it less mentally stressful, or is that just a doomed section?
I don't think it's a doom section. I think that there are ways to make it more interesting. And what I will tell you is that if you find yourself being really bored with the RC material, I've had clients that were super bored with the RC material, and basically universally they have come to me post-test day and been like, that was actually interesting. The adrenaline and the pressure of test day may actually end up making the material in the RC sections more interesting to you. It's one of maybe only a few benefits, but definitely a possible benefit of being there on test days that you won't get bored with the material.
Mm,
I think making RC easier has a lot to do with, I think one of the ways I've found to make RC easier is just treat it like big LR, right?
mm,
You have to kind of tear the passage to pieces, right?
yeah.
It can't just be read the passage and tell me what the narrative structure of the passage was. It has to be, why was this passage written? Who probably wrote this passage? How did they feel about the issues? Ask yourself hypothetical questions. Even like little hypothetical questions while you're reading can keep you engaged. Okay, so the author is saying that this farming practice led to a major famine in this country. Would the author say that not pursuing that farming practice would have caused the famine to not happen? Well, maybe not. The author's acknowledging new practices now, right? Keep yourself engaged by asking yourself questions. Your objective should be to, insofar as you can in 2.5 to 3 minutes, right? Rip the passage, rip those 4 paragraphs to pieces, but don't try to predict what you're going to be asked about, because that to me is actually a futile exercise.
Yeah. Yeah. Trying to engage and tear the passage to pieces, it feels annoying to do up front a little bit because like on one hand it is helpful in that you can maybe develop a little bit of interest in the passage, but it is like a different type of reading, I would say, than what people are normally used to, where you just kind of read and you just kind of like enjoy it. But it is a great way to save mental energy in the long run, because then once you do get to the questions, you're going to have much less going back to the passage and trying to do a frantic scurry to like look for the right answer, because you will have a sense of what a right answer will do because you have developed that familiarity with the passage. And so it is weird because it's like you kind of have to like front load a little bit of that, cognition, but it's worth it in the end, because once you do get to the questions, you'll be able to answer them with a lot more,
Mm-hmm.
oh my, what's the word I'm looking for? I feel like this week I've just been completely, I cannot think of words. You'll feel a lot more, I guess, confident. You'll feel a lot more confident in your answer.
Good.
Yeah, there it is. Yeah, right. Yeah, good with your answer. And I also think too, one other little element just to mention is that RC, you're probably naturally just going to be a little bit less confident in your answers, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
If you, it's a lot harder sometimes to look at an answer and be like, I know exactly why this is right, as opposed to being, I feel like I remember that this is right, and let me pick this, because there's just so much more stimulus than there
Mm-hmm.
is in an LR question where there's a lot less stimulus. Yeah. So I think those are some, I mean, some wise words. That's some good wisdom here, I think, that we've imparted so far.
I try
Yeah.
every day to impart wise wisdom.
Yes, wise. The 7 Sage wisdom. It's the wisest of it. So
We have to provide the wisest wisdom.
that is that's what we attempt to do. I guess what happens if we don't? I don't know. People stop listening.
Yeah. People
Well,
stop listening. Well, maybe people are going to anyways. Doesn't matter
yeah.
how wise the wisdom is.
No one's actually listening right now. So yeah, they all left.
They all
But
left.
I guess we could wrap this up here. So just to maybe to recap, couple of the things to think about. If you're feeling fatigued, maybe not much of a fatigue problem, and maybe more of like a process problem.
Mm-hmm.
You need to improve the first couple sections so you're not feeling as fatigued. Thinking about wrong answers when you're doing it. You don't need to have the entire answer choice doesn't need to be evaluated. If one piece looks bad, then just toss it. Looking for those patterns so you get better at identifying right answers, and then with RC tearing apart the passage. I'm sure I'm missing some things, but you could just look. I guess you could go back to what else? What did I miss there?
No, I think you've got. I think that all of that is important. I want to echo the thing that you said at the end, which is your confidence level on RC answer choices is going to be a little lower, and that's okay. There's just more to deal with, right? If you are seeking 100% certainty on an answer choice, especially on RC, you're probably not going to find it, and that is fine, right? Set your standard for confidence a little bit lower for RC, not so low that you get questions wrong, but a little lower so that you feel more comfortable picking answer choices faster, right? And that should get you to where you need to be.
Yeah, perfect. All right. Well, I don't know, any last little sign off here?
You know what? I wish I thought of a cool sign off, guys, but I'm arguably the least cool human being on the planet. I am on an LSAT podcast. My only comment for you all is please like, comment, subscribe to the channel, ask questions. If we answer your questions in a future video, I'm pretty sure you get a month free of live classes so that you can come hang out with Henry and I and ask your questions to us as well.
Yeah, we'd love to see you.
We would.
And also,
we really
you get a
would.
free month of live if we answer your question. So feel free to ask as many questions as possible. We'll see you guys in the future, and yeah, have a great day. Peace.
Take care of yourselves.